On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent two of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." The disciples went into the city and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They were saddened, and one by one they said to him, "Surely you don't mean me?" "It is one of the 12, he replied, "one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he said to them. "Truly I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. "You will all fall away," Jesus told them, "for it is written, 'I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered.' But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same. I think the reality is that most meals are fairly unmemorable. Most meals are just a regular occurrence in our life that blend into our day. I struggled to tell you what I ate on Friday, let alone 2 weeks ago. But sometimes we do find ourselves having a meal that is significant, that is memorable, that actually really implants itself in our memory. Sometimes that is for bad reasons, perhaps terrible service, terrible food, perhaps something extreme happened at the meal, the restaurant set on fire, I don't know. I remember one time me and Katie went out to eat, and we were having a lovely meal. We went to Frankie and Benny's, we were having a nice time. We weren't married then, it was a date, we were having a lovely time. Until towards the end of the meal, I discovered that one of my bacon chops had a sticker on the bottom, and it was one of those stickers that you stick on the side of things to tell you how long you can use it for. And that put me off my food. And I'd eaten most of it though. I got the meal for free and they gave us free pudding, so it wasn't the worst meal, but it wasn't a very good experience. But sometimes meals are memorable for good reasons, aren't they? Perhaps the food itself has stood out, it's been a particularly excellent meal. Or perhaps the meal itself hasn't been that spectacular, but it's the people you're with, or a moment in time, some reason that just really holds this meal close and as a good memory. One that stands out for me in terms of good meals is when me and Katie went to Poland. We were making the most of the fact that we had no kids at that point. Katie was very pregnant. It was the last week she was allowed to fly. We're like, let's go away somewhere. And all we could afford was Poland in February. So it was, we had some snow, we just made the most of it. But one of the meals I remember was actually when we went and ate at a small local cafe. We had beef goulash and potato pancakes. And again, the food was nice, it was good. But actually what really made it stand out was the fact that it felt nice and authentic. It felt not like a touristy place, but actually a local place where we were getting a feel for the culture. And it stood out because it was probably one of our last meals out before Ezra was born. It was a special meal, and Very cheap, that also made it stand out, because it wasn't for tourists. But it really stood out in our minds and our memories. It's one that I'll always remember. And actually, when we look at Jesus' ministry, we see that his ministry is full of memorable, significant meals. Actually, Jesus' first recorded miracle takes place at a wedding feast where he turns water into wine. Jesus shares a meal, a small meal, loaves and fishes, with over 5,000 people. Jesus invites Zacchaeus round for dinner, and Zacchaeus is totally transformed. Jesus eats with a Pharisee, and a woman comes and washes his feet with her tears and her hair. Actually, Jesus eats with some of the disciples after he has died and is resurrected. There are so many significant meals in Jesus' ministry. And I imagine there's some that aren't even written down. Those times where Jesus just eats a simple meal with his disciples, but it sticks in their mind. Today's verses perhaps focus on what is the most significant meal in Jesus' ministry. Perhaps one of the most significant meals in history. A meal that has led to a practice that has been shared by Christians throughout time and across the world. Perhaps we call it communion, or maybe we call it Eucharist. Some places will call it Mass, or Holy Communion, or the Last Supper. Some churches will share it every week. Some churches only once a year. Some not at all. Some share it with great grandeur. I remember when I was in Haworth, we did a pulpit swap with all the ministers, and I went to preach at the Catholic church. And it was a lot easier, because when you go to preach at the Catholic church, it's about 5 minutes long. So it's a lot less to prepare. But I remember them sharing Mass, and because I wasn't Catholic, I wasn't allowed it. And I remember them sharing Mass, and it was, it was great grandeur. They had chalices and lots of gold, and there was something hidden behind a curtain. They had to unlock it to get the bread out, and it was just all this grandeur. Whereas actually some places you go, it's just practiced really simply. That's not a bad thing. It's practiced simply and powerfully. There's loads of different ways that we celebrate this meal. But actually, I think today I'm not going to focus on the how. I'm going to focus on the why. On the significance, on why we do this, on why it's important. And I remember hearing the story of two church ministers having a bit of a debate, we'll call it. Having a bit of a debate about communion, about how they should do it. And it was one minister who their church shared it once a year, and that was it. They did communion once a year. And the other minister, they did it every week. And they were discussing for a while about how it should be done, why they were doing it, all this kind of stuff. Until they realised that actually, the church that did it once a year because it was so special and it was so precious that they wanted to do it once a year to make it that one significant event. But the church that was doing it every week were doing it every week because it was so precious, it was so significant. And whilst their methods differed, actually how they felt about it was the same. And so today we're not going to focus on how we do it, whether we should have it from tiny cups, whether we should have it from a big cup, whether we should share it from one loaf, whether we should have those little wafers that keep better. We're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on the why, on the what is going on here. And actually the first thing to remember is that this meal was significant, not simply for the future, but for Jesus' disciples in the there and their now. The story goes that Jesus and his disciples have got the meal ready. They get there. Jesus sits down and the hubble bubble starts. And then Jesus stands up and he says, "Disciples, welcome to the Last Supper." And his disciples just look at him. "What do you mean the Last Supper?" Actually for the disciples it was not the Last Supper. They weren't thinking of it in that matter. They weren't thinking this is the last meal we are going to share with Jesus. It's titled that in our Bibles, but for the disciples, it starts as a normal Passover meal. For the Jewish people, we know that Passover is a hugely significant festival, and this meal is a key part of that. So Jesus' disciples have been sent to prepare this meal, and they come expecting, I guess, nothing out of the ordinary. It's a meal that is more than just food. It is not just about eating together, but it's a meal that says something, a meal that means something to all who share it together. And for Jesus' disciples, this Passover is going to be the most significant by far. Actually, Passover is quite possibly the most important of the Jewish festivals. And like many of the Jewish festivals, it is designed to focus on and reflect on their liberation from Egypt, on God's rescue. You know, throughout the Passover meal, this story is told and demonstrated through many actions. And in fact, in a few weeks, CMJ, I always get them the wrong way around. CMJ are going to come and share a bit of the story behind the Passover meal about what is done, and we're going to eat together. Actually, there's so much symbolism, so many representative actions in the food that is eaten, the way that it is shared, questions that are asked. And celebrating Passover is a deeply religious act. But at times when the Jewish people were facing real oppression, which included the time of Jesus when they were under oppression by the Romans, it's also a deeply political act. It's an act that says, despite appearances, we are not oppressed. We are God's free people. And this is the meal that disciples expect to be sharing with Jesus. But Jesus will take this meal and make it different in significant ways, both for his disciples, but also for Christians throughout the last 2,000 years and into the future. Now, it starts with Jesus' secretive instructions to two of his disciples. It feels like something out of a spy movie. Go into the city and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him and say to the owner of the house as he enters, the teacher asks, where is my guest room? Where may I eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there. Actually, these slightly cryptic sounding instructions are a bit reminiscent of Jesus' instructions to his disciples on Palm Sunday, where he tells them to go and find this donkey. Actually, Jesus intends secrecy, I think, at this occasion. We know that Judas was ready to betray him. The authorities are longing to arrest him. We also know that the crowds loved Jesus. They wanted to spend as much time with him as possible. And he would have had people coming to him asking for teaching, for healing. And so Jesus just lets known to two of his disciples in advance, because this meal is important. It is important that it's not interrupted, either by those who long to see him or by those who long to see his end. And so his disciples get the meal ready. The table is set. Jesus and his friends sit down. They begin to share this meal. And as they do, Jesus begins to speak. And actually, we see that Jesus is aware of his betrayal that is coming. When he's reclining at the table, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one of you who is eating with me." The disciples are saddened. One by one they say to him, "Surely you don't mean me." "It is one of the 12, he replied, "one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him." And so the disciples are saddened. They hear that one of them is going to betray Jesus. And they all say, "Surely not me, surely not me, surely it won't be me that betrays you, Jesus." Now we know it's Judas. Judas knew it was Judas. The rest of the disciples didn't know it was Judas. But actually the reality is, whilst Judas betrays Jesus, before the night is over, all of the disciples will fail Jesus. Later in Mark's Gospel, and actually later in our verses today, we hear that all the disciples will abandon him. You know, they say, "No, I won't do that." Peter, even Peter, who declares, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." Even Peter will deny Jesus, will abandon Jesus, will disown him. While the disciples can't quite believe it, we know that this is true. I think this reminds us, there's this shadow over the meal that reminds us of the reality that all of us fall short. Even those closest to Jesus fell short. That in different ways and at different times, all of us have chosen to turn our back on Jesus, to do things our own way, to deny him. And as we see, and we continue Mark's Gospel over the next few weeks, we will see this again and again with the disciples. But actually in today's verses and throughout the Gospels, this is not the end of the story. And this isn't the end of the meal. Jesus doesn't leave it here at, I will be betrayed, you will all disown me. But the Passover meal continues, and Jesus has more to say. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he said to them. "Truly I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it in the kingdom of God." Now these verses are so familiar to us. These are verses we often hear as we share communion together, or similar ones from the different Gospels or from Paul's letters. These verses remind us that this meal that we share is important. It's not just a man-made tradition, but something that is instituted by Jesus himself. I wonder how his disciples felt, though, when suddenly their Passover meal changes. That Passover meal they've shared for years and years with the same words, the same symbolism. Well, Jesus has just taken it. He's taken that retelling process, those specific things that are done in specific order, and turned it towards his death. Turned it towards what is going to happen. Because towards the end of the Passover meal, the remainder of the unleavened bread would have been eaten. And this is probably where we get to in verse 22, when Jesus goes off script. When he says, "Take it, this is my body." Actually, this is not what the disciples were expecting. Jesus takes these signs and symbols of faithfulness to the Jewish people, the bread and the wine, these reminders of God's liberation, freedom from the oppression of the Egyptian, and he puts a new twist on them. Instead of using the familiar words, he uses new words. The unleavened bread, which is supposed to remind them of their hasty departure from Egypt. Actually, Jesus says, "This is my body, which is broken." The cup, which represents the blood of the Passover lamb, Jesus tells them that this blood, actually, this is the blood of the new covenant. This is his blood. A blood poured out for many. Jesus takes something so familiar to his disciples, but uses words which point to his imminent death. Words that will help his disciples make sense of what is to come. And I don't think I normally, when I'm taking communion, realize actually how radical this would have been. You know, Passover is shared even now in a particular way. But Jesus takes it and he twists it. He takes this meal that points back to the deliverance of God's people and uses it to point to something new. Now, some might argue that actually, well, Jesus must not have thought very much about Passover if he wasn't willing to stick to the traditions. But I think the opposite is true. That Jesus knew the importance of this meal because he knew what this meal would ultimately point to. That actually this meal is not just about liberation from the Egyptians, but actually through Jesus' death and resurrection, Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of God's liberation, the ultimate fulfillment of God's freedom, of God's promise and God's covenant. And as I've been planning this week, I mean, we're not sharing communion this week, we're sharing it next week, but as I've been planning this, thinking about communion, thinking about Passover, reading these words, for me it's brought a new richness, bringing some new meaning to something that has become so familiar in many ways. You know, the Jews celebrated their freedom from the Egyptians, and I think many of Jesus' followers hoped that Jesus would bring them freedom from the oppression of the Romans. But actually, through Jesus' broken body and his poured out blood, we are not simply freed from human oppressors, but we are freed from the oppression of sin and death. We are freed from a life separated from God, and we are brought into a life in his kingdom, in his family. Actually, just as the Israelites fled Egypt and Moses parted the Red Sea so they could escape, as they were led through the wilderness by the presence of God, actually at the moment of Jesus' death, the curtain in the temple is torn in two, reminding us that God's presence isn't contained in the temple, but God's presence dwells with us. It leads us, it guides us. And just as the blood of the Passover lamb was used in that first Passover to safeguard the firstborns against death, actually through Jesus' blood, Jesus, who is the firstborn over all creation, death is turned away from all who put their trust in him. You know, as we see the shadow of the disciples' betrayal and abandonment hang over this table, we remember that all fall short. But as they share together in the bread and the wine, we remember that Jesus' death, his body and his blood, restore us to him. And we will share in the communion meal next week. And I think the communion meal is a gospel meal. It is a meal that reminds us that whilst we all fall short, that whilst all of us, no matter how holy we might feel, no matter how good we might think we are, especially when we compare ourselves to other people, or even how close we necessarily feel to Jesus, we all at times dishonour and disown him. You know, all of those closest to him dishonoured and disowned him. But this meal reminds us that no matter how far we fall, no matter how broken, no matter how far away from God we might feel, no matter how unworthy we might feel, that we are made whole through Jesus' body and blood. Through his death and resurrection, we are restored to him. As we share in the bread and the wine, we are reminded of God's covenant to his people as they fled Egypt, but also of the new covenant, God's covenant of grace. We are reminded that we are joined into God's family. That as we share in the bread and wine, we are joined in that way with Christians across the world and throughout time doing the same. This meal, whether it is kept simply or magnificently, whether it is remembered weekly or yearly, whether the words are whispered, shouted or sung, whether shared in homes or in great cathedrals, this meal is perhaps the central reminder, the central means by which Jesus' death and resurrection are known, celebrated, believed and lived out by generations gone by and generations to come. And so as we look forward to this meal next week, sharing it together, I want to encourage you to think about the significance of this meal. Not just to let it become something so familiar, so commonplace, almost like a ritual that loses some of its meaning, but to really spend time this week thinking about what it means for you. Reminding ourselves of Jesus' death and resurrection. But I also want to say this morning that if there is anybody who perhaps is feeling unworthy, unwelcome or unloved, if there is anybody that has not yet accepted Jesus, his love, his forgiveness through his death and resurrection, well, I think today is a good day to do so. Actually, today as we hear this reminder of Jesus' freedom, liberation from sin and death, his restoration into a relationship with him, well, if that's something you want today, then please don't go home without speaking to me, or somebody else would happily pray for you. But today we remember that Jesus' body and his blood, broken and shed, are for us. We remember that new covenant that gives us hope. So let us spend this week preparing ourselves to share communion together next Sunday, to share in his death and resurrection until he comes again. Let's pray.